the show with Little Richard. Little Richard refused to go before James Brown. Would not go before him. And Mr. Brown like, he's gonna sit here.
What terrible secret about James Brown did Little Richard take to his grave? These two music legends changed the world with their talent, but did they hide something shocking? People close to them have hinted at dark truths.
And I took the Beatles and Mick Jagger with me. Mick Jagger was living on a truck. I had Jimi Hendrix playing guitar for me. I had Billy Preston on the organ, James Brown, and Joe Tex was my vocalist.
But what were they? Did they fear exposing the truth? Why didn't they speak out before they died? Let's uncover the mystery behind the secret they never revealed. Richard's childhood had some very strange moments. One of the weirdest things he ever did was giving people his poop as a gift. Yes, you heard that right. Little Richard, as a child, thought it was funny to put his poop in a box or a jar and hand it to others. One of the most famous stories about this happened when he gave a woman a box for her birthday. He had gone to the bathroom in the box, closed it up, and handed it to her with a big smile. She was happy and excited to see what was inside. She took it home and waited until she was with her friends to open it. Little Richard watched from outside, waiting for her reaction. When she finally opened the box, she screamed in horror. She yelled, "I'm going to kill him." But Richard just laughed and laughed. He thought it was the funniest thing ever. This was not the only time he played with his poop. He once did it again, but this time he put it in a jelly jar. He carefully placed the jar among his mother's food preserves. He was proud of himself, thinking it was a great joke. But his mother was furious when she found out. She did not find it funny at all. His family thought he was a little crazy for doing things like that. Maybe he was just a mischievous child, or maybe he liked shocking people. Either way, this was something he did more than once. Besides his strange habit, Little Richard also had physical differences that made him stand out. He had a very large head but a small body. One of his eyes was bigger than the other, but the biggest difference was that one of his legs was shorter than the other by about 3 inches. This made him walk in a way that looked unusual. His steps were uneven and his hips swayed from side to side. Other kids noticed this and teased him. They made fun of the way he walked and called him names. Some even said he was trying to walk like a girl.
I would wear makeup. They would let me sing for the white girls. When I put on eyelashes and all that, they would let me sing. But when I went as a just straight dude, they wouldn't let me sing.
Little Richard was often bullied because of this. But instead of letting it bring him down, he used it as motivation. He wanted to be better than everyone else. He wanted to prove that he was special. He became very competitive, always trying to be the best at everything. Coming from a family of 12 siblings, there was always someone to compete with. He had to be strong to stand out. His mother thought the church might help him. She believed that if he spent time in church, maybe God would heal his leg. Of course, his leg never changed, but something else did. While in church, Richard discovered his voice. He realized he could sing, and not just any singing. His voice was powerful. He could hit notes that made people stop and listen. Church was where he first started singing in front of people. It was the beginning of his journey to becoming a star.
I want you all to know that I am the king of rock and roll!
But life at home was not easy. His father, Bud Penniman, was very strict and did not accept Richard for who he was. He did not like that Richard grew his hair long, wore makeup, and acted in ways that were not considered manly. He was a church deacon and believed boys should act a certain way. When Richard put on his mother's curtains and called himself the Magnificent One, his father was not amused. Instead of laughing or ignoring it, he was angry. Bud Penniman did not just scold Richard. He was violent. He tied Richard up and beat him badly. It was cruel and painful. Richard was just a boy, and instead of being loved, he was hurt and rejected by his own father. When the beatings did not fix Richard, his father took an even harsher step. He kicked Richard out of the house when he was only 13 years old. A child with no home, no support, and no protection, Richard had to find his own way.
When you're hungry, you can sing too.
I bet.
When you're down and out, you can sing. When you know.
Luckily, he found a new family in a white couple named Ann and Johnny Johnson. They took him in and treated him with kindness. The Johnsons owned a club called the Tick-Tock Club. It was in that club that Little Richard started performing. The very thing that his father hated, his music, became his path to success. The rejection he faced from his family pushed him to become even stronger. He wanted to prove that he was worth something. Ironically, later on, Richard's father started changing his mind. He began to feel proud of Richard's music. He listened to his songs and even planned to buy him a car to help with his travels. It seemed like maybe, just maybe, their relationship could be repaired. But life had other plans. Richard's father was killed outside his own bar. The person who shot him was Frank Tanner, one of Richard's best friends. The reason behind the shooting was unclear. Some say it started with a fight over firecrackers being thrown into a stove. Whatever happened, Bud Penniman was dead. Little Richard lost his father in an instant. Even though Bud had been harsh and cruel, he was still Richard's father. It was a shocking and painful event. To make Thin G's even stranger, Frank Tanner was only in jail for a week before he was released. It was never clear why he killed Bud, and the truth was never fully explained.
When I came about, everybody thought I was crazy. And they would call the music terrible, and bad.
His music was full of energy, his voice was powerful, and his performances were wild.
And after, you start winning with it, everybody got on the bandwagon in the boat.
Everybody followed you.
Everybody started claiming and naming and blaming.
He faced many problems. The music industry did not treat him fairly, and he believed that racism played a big part in this. He saw other artists, especially white singers, take his songs and make more money from them than he did. One of the biggest examples was Tutti Frutti. When Little Richard recorded Tutti Frutti, it became a huge hit, but soon after, a singer named Pat Boone recorded his own version of the song. Boone's version became even more popular, even though many people thought it was not very good. Little Richard believed that this happened because Boone was white. He felt that the music industry gave white artists more opportunities and success, even when they copied black musicians. This was not just a one-time thing. Little Richard saw this happen again and again. Other singers, like Elvis Presley, became superstars while performing songs that were originally made famous by black artists like Little Richard.
If you'd been what?
Or if I was been white, Elvis would have never been.
Little Richard worked very hard and wanted the same respect as white musicians. But he noticed that he was treated differently. When he performed in places like Las Vegas, he was not given the same treatment as white musicians. His hotel rooms were not as nice, and he was often paid less money. This made him angry, and he spoke out about it. He demanded to be treated fairly. But even though he spoke up, things did not change much. The music industry continued to favor white artists, and Little Richard felt that his hard work was not appreciated as much as it should have been. He did not stay quiet about his feelings. He told people that he was the real architect of rock and roll. He wanted the world to know that he helped create rock and roll music. But he noticed something strange. When people talked about a white musician, they called him the King of Rock and Roll. But when Little Richard called himself the King of Rock and Roll, people added the words self-proclaimed. He believed that this was another example of racism. He felt that the music industry did not want to give him full credit for what he had done.
I want you all to know that I am the king of rock and roll.
He also had a wild side. He lived a very extreme lifestyle. He did a lot of drugs and partied all the time. He admitted that he was addicted to cocaine.
I took so much cocaine, my nose was big enough to park diesel trucks. My nose would be packed. So much that my membranes would just be coming out on the handkerchiefs, just blood.
He once said that he spent $1,000 a day on cocaine. That is a huge amount of money to spend on drugs. His addiction became so bad that his nose would bleed and sometimes even flesh would come out when he blew his nose.
When I was first came in rock and roll, I didn't drink or smoke. I didn't know anything about drugs because I never seen it in my hometown.
His drug use was not the only extreme thing about his life. He also had a complicated love life. He had relationships with both men and women. He was very open about his sexuality and enjoyed watching other people together. He even asked his girlfriends to be with other men while he watched. One of his girlfriends was a woman named Audrey Robinson. He met her when she was very young, and she later changed her name to Angel. Little Richard claimed that she did things to excite him, including being with other men while he watched. But Angel said that some of the things he said were not true. It is possible that his drug use made him remember things differently. Little Richard's wild lifestyle was very different from the way he was raised. He grew up in a very religious family. His father was a deacon, and many of his relatives were preachers. He was raised in the church and taught to follow strict religious rules. But as he got older, he felt torn between his faith and his lifestyle. He wanted to enjoy life, but he also felt guilty about it. He believed that his attraction to men was against his religion. This made him feel very confused. He would often leave the music industry and focus on religion, but he always returned to rock and roll.
I've been seeking.
At one point, he decided to leave music and go to college to study religion. But even while he was in school, he could not stop himself from acting on his desires. He was caught asking a deacon's son to expose himself, which got him in trouble. He also tried to have a career as a gospel singer, but it did not work out. So he went back to his old lifestyle of parties, music, and fame. In 1975, something happened that made him rethink his life again. His brother died, and he felt guilty because he had promised to help him but chose to party instead. This made him decide to turn back to God. He left music again and became a preacher. He said that he wanted to live a clean life. In 1995, he seemed to accept himself more and said that God was loving and accepting. But in 2017, he changed again and said that he needed to repent. It seemed like he was always struggling to find peace in his life. Little Richard also had some scary experiences. In 1985, he was in a terrible car accident. He crashed into a telephone pole while driving late at night. The crash was so bad that firefighters had to use special tools to get him out of the car. He broke his leg and injured his ribs. Some people said that he was lucky to be alive, but Little Richard believed that God saved him. He thought that the accident was a sign that he needed to stay on the right path.
Famous musical native Little Richard was in a car accident this week. Richard was the front seat passenger in a car that was in a crash in Murfreesboro, Tennessee.
Even though he tried to leave rock and roll behind, he always came back to it. He could not stay away from music for long. His love for music was too strong, but he always felt like the music industry did not respect him as much as it should have. He knew that he was one of the pioneers of rock and roll, but he did not feel like he got the credit he deserved. He fought for his place in history and never gave up on telling the world what he had done. No matter what he went through, one thing never changed: his love for the stage. Richard was born as Richard Wayne Penniman in Macon, Georgia. He grew up in a big family with 11 brothers and sisters. His father, Bud, was a strict man who sold illegal alcohol. As a teenager, Richard struggled with his feelings. He was attracted to men, but also had relationships with women. He was raised in a religious family, and at the time, people saw being gay as wrong. He tried to act like he was straight, dating women to hide the truth. One of his girlfriends, Lee Angel, and his wife, Ernestine Campbell, never believed he was gay. Instead, they thought he had an addiction to something else, pleasuring himself too much. Richard once admitted that during that time, he would do this up to 8 or 9 times a day.
Very brave, because I'm such a fan. You were the first performer, I think, ever to come out and say, I am a homosexual.
Yes, and everybody got mad with me for...
One of the most shocking stories was about a threesome that supposedly involved Richard, his girlfriend, and the famous singer Buddy Holly. According to Richard, Buddy and Angel were together while he watched. Angel was furious when she heard this story and denied that it ever happened. At the time, she was an exotic dancer, and Richard loved being around wild and exciting people. Richard had a unique way of looking at life. He believed that every person had both male and female sides inside them. He thought people should follow their feelings and love whoever they wanted. James Brown and Little Richard had a unique and complicated relationship. They were both big names in music, but in the early days, James Brown was still trying to make it. Little Richard was already a star, and his schedule was very busy. He had so many shows booked that sometimes he couldn't make it to all of them. Instead of canceling, he would send James Brown in his place. This might sound surprising, but it really happened. James Brown would dress up like Little Richard and perform for him. At that time, James Brown was still unknown, so most people didn't notice the difference. He had the talent, and he knew how to put on a great show. It was a big opportunity for him. He got to perform in front of large crowds and learn from one of the biggest stars in rock and roll. A filmmaker named Lisa Cortez talked about this in her documentary, Little Richard, I Am Everything. She shared this story during a film festival. She said that Little Richard would get so busy that he needed someone to take his place. James Brown was the perfect choice because he could sing, dance, and bring the same kind of energy to the stage. Little Richard was a major influence on James Brown. He was known for his wild performances, his flashy clothes, and his loud, powerful voice. James Brown watched and learned from him. Later, when James Brown became famous on his own, people could see Little Richard's influence in his performances. But James Brown was not the only one inspired by Little Richard. Many famous musicians like Mick Jagger and David Bowie also learned from him. Even though some people think Elvis Presley was the first big star of rock and roll, many believe that Little Richard was actually the one who started it all. He called himself the originator, the emancipator, and the architect of rock and roll. He was proud of his influence and wanted people to know his place in music history. James Brown went on to become one of the most famous musicians in history. He was called the Godfather of Soul because of his powerful voice and incredible stage presence. But he never forgot his early days, performing in place of Little Richard. That experience helped him grow as an artist and prepared him for his own career.
This is a man's world.
Little Richard's impact on music is huge. He broke barriers, brought energy to the stage, and inspired generations of musicians. His music and style changed the way people saw rock and roll. Even though James Brown became his own legend, his connection to Little Richard was a big part of his journey. Their relationship was not just about one helping the other. It was about inspiration, learning, and respect. Little Richard gave James Brown a chance, and James Brown took that chance and built an unforgettable career. Their bond shaped the music industry in ways that still matter today. Another problem with the film is that it tries too hard to show Little Richard as someone who was ignored and mistreated by the music industry. It mentions that he never won a Grammy Award for his music, which makes it seem like he was unfairly overlooked. However, the Grammy Awards only started in 1959, after many of his biggest hits. Also, in the early days of the Grammys, rock and roll was not as respected as other types of music, like jazz and pop. The film does not explain this, which makes the story feel one-sided. The documentary also suggests that Little Richard was not given enough credit compared to white artists like Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis. It is true that racism played a role in the music industry, and black artists often did not get the same level of recognition. However, Little Richard also made choices that affected his career. He left the music industry at the height of his fame to become a preacher, and when he returned, he struggled to make new hits. Many musicians, including white artists like Elvis, had ups and downs in their careers. The film does not fully explore these issues, which makes its argument feel incomplete.
Music. If you'd been what?
Oh, if I was been white, Elvis would have never been.
Overall, Little Richard, I Am Everything, is an interesting documentary, but it has some major flaws. It talks a lot about his personal struggles and the challenges of black and queer artists, but it does not focus enough on his actual music career. It also tries too hard to make him seem like a victim, instead of showing the full picture of his life and choices. Little Richard was an incredible musician, and his impact on rock and roll is undeniable. The documentary starts an important conversation about his role in music history, but it does not do justice to his legacy. Even though he was famous, he had one big regret. He wished he had been more educated so that he could protect himself from unfair record deals. Little Richard loved making music, but he was not treated fairly by the music industry. He once said that he was ignorant and illiterate, meaning he didn't know much about business. He was so happy to be famous that he didn't think about the contracts he was signing. Record companies took advantage of him. If he could live his life again, he said, he would want to be more educated so that he could protect himself.
It was really so much money, I didn't know what to do with it. It was too much. I'd be giving it away, throwing it away. I said, oh boy, it's just too many zeros behind.
One example of how he was treated unfairly was his contract for Tutti Frutti. This was one of his biggest songs, but he was only paid $50.50 for each record sold. The song sold 500,000 copies, but he only made $25,000. That may sound like a lot, but it was much less than what white musicians were making. Other artists who sold that many records often earned much more money. It wasn't just about the money from selling records. Little Richard's music was used in many ways without him getting paid. He once saw a video of Donald Duck singing Tutti Frutti, but he didn't get a single dollar from it. He was upset because people were making money from his music, but he wasn't getting anything. This is why he later sued several music companies, asking for $112 million in unpaid royalties. One of the biggest problems black artists faced at that time was that they were often paid a one-time fee for their songs. This meant they lost the right to earn money from their music in the future. Record companies made a lot of money from these songs, but the artists who created them didn't. Meanwhile, white musicians got better deals and were paid more for their music. Even though he was treated unfairly, Little Richard fought back. He sued the record companies to get the money he deserved. The lawsuit was eventually settled, but the amount was never made public. In the 1980s, Michael Jackson bought the rights to Specialty Records, which included Little Richard's music. Jackson later gave Little Richard the rights to his own songs, which was a small victory for him.